I came up with this idea for financing and innovation culture around a year ago, but I thought it's worth revisiting in this video just as to make sure you've got an explanation really of what I had in mind. And it's really the start of a series I'm going to do on innovation and creating an innovation culture. So finance, really important in that respect. So the first thing I wanted to look at was what your current cultural temperature is. And by cultural temperature, I kind of mean the general vibe around the office and how people feel really about working for your company or organization. And one of the ways of assessing the comfort really in sharing ideas is to look at assessing emotional safety of your teams and what the response is when they share their ideas within your organization, you know, just in a day-to-day sense, really. So the first option is to use an opinion survey, which many people do on an anonymous basis. And that kind of gives a generic view of how people feel. But there are other indicators of how safe or well people might feel within your organization. And one of them is the level of sickness that you might have due to mental health or stress. And the other kind of key indicator, I think, is how long an average member of your team works for you and the overall longevity of service within the organization, which is generally an indicator that people are happier rather than not. The next couple of things are more qualitative than quantitative. So these are based around kind of how active your teams are in terms of socializing, whether that's through a social committee internally or whether that's extracurricular activities outside of the company. And also how proactive their participation is in your social media channels. So I'm not just thinking of how many of your team maybe like or share your posts. I'm actually thinking about how many of your team are actively commenting on say the press releases that you've just made, or even posting independently of those press releases off their own back, if you like. So I think that is increasingly an indicator of kind of happiness or engagement with an organization. And I have noticed under lockdown that the participation in social media has dropped across a lot of companies. So I would imagine that indicates some kind of disconnection within the teams of each company that I'm looking at and following. The other thing I was thinking about was using something like Net Promoter Score, which is usually used for customer satisfaction. And essentially, it's whether a customer would recommend that company to somebody else. And I guess you could use the same Net Promoter Score kind of principle to see whether your employees would recommend that company for someone else to work. And then as you walk around an organization or walk around the office or even go on your Zoom calls at the moment, to see whether there's a general vibe of positivity and enthusiasm about what you're doing and what you're achieving as a company. In terms of assessing how your culture's going and what the core issues are in terms of kind of generically across the board, in terms of the culture that you currently have, I was thinking about using a Fishbone technique, which is based in Lean Six Sigma theory. And here really each bone, if you like, on the fish is a kind of category of types of issues you might have. And I've listed here some of the common things that people have expressed either in companies I've worked or recently under lockdown. So low morale and low productivity are generally quite a nebulous thing to measure, but you would maybe see them in any low scores on Glassdoor, people with conflicting priorities and not understanding their overall objectives. In communication issues and siloed teams, then really that means there's a kind of a divide between maybe your senior leaders and the middle management team or the people on the floor, if you like. And in siloed teams, looking at the communication issues across the organization and between related teams potentially. And then maybe looking at something like diversity in the senior management, and maybe that the minority voices aren't heard as often as the senior leaders or, you know, the majority. And perhaps overall, and this could be a real reason for introducing an innovation culture, perhaps you have a low pace of change, and so that your ideation isn't really turning into true change across the business. So to help measure where you are in culture, I thought about a couple of models that I got from a book called Business Model Generation, and started thinking about how you would assess the current culture and also move to the desired culture that your organization might have. And so I started to think about how you kind of push the start button on that engine. So if you're perhaps in a period of sort of where things aren't really changing, where things seem to have remained static for a number of years and you're not sure why, perhaps one way of measuring where you are to start with is to use something like this, which is the core business type model from the Business Model Generation book. In here, it looks at product innovation, customer relationship management, and infrastructure management as the three key areas where companies distinguish themselves, really. And they distinguish themselves in different areas, either under economics, competition, or culture. So I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes whilst you read this table. And the stars I've put on this table are where I think a lot of academic publishers have been in the last few years, and perhaps this applies to society publishers to some extent as well. So having paused on where you might be now, I started to think about where most publishers might like to be at the moment. And I've starred the areas where really you probably would want to sit as a publisher who is being innovative. One of them might be in terms of product innovation, that you're early to market with any new things. I think inevitably with large publishers and perhaps some society publishers playing in the same space, there is a battle for scope, and that could be quite difficult to move away from. But the other area, which I think is common to both academic publishers that are large and the society publishers, are how kind of the creative stars of your organization are nurtured and heard. So sometimes these are called the unicorns, the kind of ideators of an organization. So I think most innovative companies have a way of kind of hearing what those people are saying and turning that into real research and development. But it's quite possible at the moment that a lot of organizations don't sit in a space where those employees are really understood and supported in the right way. So if we think about this being the desired core business type, then the second area I wanted to look at is what the desired culture would be in each of those areas. So by culture, I thought I would break that down to leadership, the social expectations and kind of interaction patterns within the company, and also how and where you recognize employees for kind of aligning perhaps with the kind of innovation direction that you would like. So in this case, I've highlighted that you really need kind of flexible leadership style in order to create innovative products. In terms of the infrastructure, there needs to be a level of communication throughout the organization so that different teams and different roles can collaborate really easily together. And then thirdly, there needs to be some kind of recognition for the contributors, coming up with those ideas and those ideas turning into valuable business options, or perhaps they're tried and failed, and then perhaps they're tried again in a different form, and that time they succeed. So in highlighting the different areas and different kind of modus operandi of cultures that are innovative, I was thinking about then how you might budget to get to the desired culture and the desired kind of core business type. So what I came up with was where the stars sat on those two, graphs. Then we could highlight where the investment might need to be. So half of the stars were in product innovation section. One of them was in customer relationship management, and two of them were in infrastructure management. So I thought from a very simple perspective, that should kind of represent where investment might need to go. And so when I was thinking about investment, what I was actually thinking about was having a change management budget, and that change management budget would be distributed across projects that kind of sat in these spaces. And then I thought about how, if you were to spend 50% of your annual change budget on product innovation, where would you actually want to spend that? Would you want to allocate a certain amount of money to R&D, which could either turn into a product or not, as the case may be, depending on how successful it was in the market, and kind of work on a kind of proof of concept basis? And so one of the biggest questions is really, from the economics perspective, how should that innovation budget be allocated? But I also highlighted on the desired culture matrix that there needs to be some investment in terms of culture around product innovation. So is that investing in a desired leadership style, or is it investing in a kind of physical and social environment for employees to interact and to come up with the best ideas in the best kind of circumstances for them, both through attitude and the kind of mechanisms of support for that product innovation? And then similarly with customer relationships management, what really is the desired relationship with customers? Is it that they keep coming back and keep purchasing and keep subscribing, or is it growth in new customers that we're looking at? And how would team members deliver on the expectation to create that relationship with customers? You know, what sort of training, rewards, resources do they have in order to make sure that they have the tools to deliver that kind of customer relationship management? And perhaps looking at how your organization compares to competitors, although sometimes I think by looking at the competitor, we actually restrict and constrict the sort of change that we put in place, because what we do is aim for what they have or just over what they have, rather than the idealistic circumstances of customer relationship management. And then finally, looking at infrastructure, you know, how do the team members in your organization learn about the desired culture, and what does that actually mean intrinsically to them? You know, how do they become engaged and supportive of those cultural aims? And really, what happens if they don't conform to those cultural aims? So is there a culture of reprimand, for example, or kind of mandating certain desired culture? Sometimes I think that can be very destructive, because simply by saying that you have to conform to something actually disengages people. And so I'm wondering how that kind of social expectation, that kind of desired culture kind of manifests itself. And one of the ways which I think is very successful is the sort of lead by example mechanism, rather than dictating certain values throughout the organization, although they can be stated. But there kind of needs to be representation of what that looks like, really. And then thinking about recognition, how do team members gain recognition for contributing ideas and for supporting the infrastructure of communication and delivery of the products? And what would facilitate behavior that produces a desired culture? So recognition may be monetary, it may be compliments, it may be kind of enjoying your job, and that's very nebulous in terms of measure. So it's useful to go back to the fishbone structure and to think about the kind of things that would reinforce and encourage behavior that you're really looking for within the organization. So these are the references that I've taken these ideas from. Business Model Generation was a book. Simon Sinek always talks about start with why, and he's extending to talk about leaders and how they lead, and what kind of leadership styles are really valuable within organizations. I follow Bill Gates and Gretchen Rubin, who talks about happiness. Gates is focused on climate change at the moment, but has various theories of team management, Lean Six Sigma, and my blog. So that was me, Ruth Wells, Inventing Change, talking about how to finance an innovation culture within your organizations. I'm going to move on in the next couple of films to sort of how to create that culture in a real way with real people. So I look forward to talking to you then.